Hello. Today I would like to talk about phrasing, direction, line, articulation, singing, legato, voicing. In fact, I don't think it is only related to music. It's in fact simply eloquence. More earnestness. The idea that the melodic line is not just imitating the singing. I would like to tell you this, and I can play it. But there are many ways to do that singing on the piano, of course, without the words. Over legato, delay with the bass note to give that sense of extra expression, as if you prepare, separate, and especially pronounce more intensely the consonants of the word, like Kyrie eleison, Christe eleison. Sung, the vowels always prevail and the consonants are usually evaporated. So I don't want to hear only A when you sing, but also the articulation is the moment where you say the consonant ta, la, pa, ta, ta. And this is what you do on the piano, obviously, by the articulation, which means you start the sound before there is none. Then when you project it, in fact, the hammer hits and you hear the resonance on the string that vibrates. And if it's longer, then you can connect it. You can play it inside the keys without to lift them above the keys. The fingers stay in the keys. And then overlapping legato, overstaying, they're welcome. Those things might appear self-evident to you listening to this. And I agree that in many aspects, cultivated playing in terms of the trade of the craftsmanship of piano playing should appear evident, obvious, simple, in the sense not of simplicity, but in the sense of evidence that flows like sincerity, like earnestness. That's what I meant. And you improvise something in the French impressionist or symbolist, regardless how you want to name it, descriptive music movement of the end of 19th, begin 20th century, Fauré and all. I'm improvising in that style. You can have this kind of flows of thirds in scales. And then you have a voicing that comes out more like in the imitation from the voice naturally of the human voice. But also organ in church, where the French musicians who studied composition at the Paris Conservatory until the turn of the 20th century, they had to take organ rather than piano as an instrument of trade and for their trade. And that is also because since most of them were unsuccessful composers in Alas, at least for their own survival, they had, until the separation of church and state in 1904 in France, they had organ positions, since there are 33,000 Catholic churches through the cities and villages of France, of which probably more than half have organs, and that need to be played. But of course, the organ was not only a instrument for musicians who played keyboard instrument to get a daytime job while composing on the side, unless they had personal wealth, which mostly didn't. naturally. It was also a way to cultivate in the education at the conservatory level the listening of music by layers, the polyphony in everything, chordals included. And this idea to voice is to bring out something that has longer values, like in the organ stop, and a different amount of manuals on which you can have different type of timbres, like in an orchestra, some more nasal sound, like an oboe or a flute. And then you have the other stops, which are more soft and more rounded and softer. So you have this kind of layering of colorization, timbres of sounds. Not really an orchestration for the beginning of the 20th century, but still a certain, of course, decayless. That is the major difference with the organ and the piano. And that comes down to the question of the articulation, because organs by essence being in churches which are built with stone and and windows, especially those beautiful window glasses. Anyway, the point is that the ceiling was very tall, therefore the resonance was very big, so you could sing the chants. So all the Gregorian. And of course the congregation sang, and they needed this resonance to amplify their spiritual uplifting to the heavens, or towards the uplifting, the transcendence. And so of course these organs were naturally in these acoustics, and therefore their pumped air in the pipes, in order to get some clarity of articulation on the organ, you really have to wake up early morning in order to hear. If it's a 10 or 7 or 6 or whatever amount of seconds of echo in the church. If not, you'll hear everything only very resonantly blurred. A bit like the harp, when you play without to stop the resonance, you have these harmonics that flourish, and in fact it's effervescent, it's beautiful, it's arborescence. I mean, it's like blossoming of the sound. It's like hearing something like, which is why this etude by Chopin is nicknamed the harp etude, obviously, is because it has that resonance aspect, while you have a melodic note that is supposed to come out, but discreetly. It's not supposed to be like stickingly loud. Cortot, in his Etudes by Chopin work studies edition in the 1930s, nicknamed the last Chopin etude of the Opus 25 as the chorale of the thumb. And here it would be the chorale then of the pinky, which he didn't name like that. It's all very childish for me to nickname things like that. Some were, and some don't have to be. Anyway, the point is that the eloquence of the articulation is the capacity to expressively space the sounds so that when you speak them on the piano without lyrics, therefore without a specific meaning, but other than the harmonic, melodic mood setting, which brings in the context in which you feel you're expressing a funeral march because it's program music in the title, or Gymnopédie by Satie, who wanted his music to be background music. So in part classical music remains reflective music. When you listen to a fugue by Bach, you start thinking in order to understand, or attempt to understand. options, so many variables. Chromaticism, color in Greek, or melodic ascending half major, or descending natural minor. The tetrachords collide or slide next to each other. Mostly the Romantic era develops even more that expression of intense provoked dissonance, like the fourth ballade by Chopin, in the same key as Bach's F minor fugue from Book 1 I just played. Of course, you can use the appoggiatura to play the dissonance that brings that attacked dissonance into the resolution, compared to a suspension that is relatively less intense, because it stays over and then it resolves itself with delay. The whole idea of the delay in all classical music for centuries and centuries on was to delay what? The cadence to finish. The perfect cadence, or perhaps plagal, or minor, or minor, major, halfway. Because that is the end of the sentence, the direction of the line, where it all leads to. And in order to not finish as soon as you started, establishing your tonality with the fourth, fifth, and first degrees, which are the tonal ones, and the sixth and the third, which are the modal ones for major or minor, and of course the leading tone, that is in French called sensible, the sensitive tone. Every language has different ways of naming this function that is determining in the tonal system, is that tension release that is at the very core of the tonal system's expression, therefore punctuation and arrival point, creating a tension by the tritone, or diminished fifth, FB in this case in C major, that calls for a resolution in opening semitones or closing, in which case you go in F sharp major, and between C major and F sharp major you have another relation of tritones. So basically the sevenths, fifths, and then after you have a tritone. And so therefore the whole circle of fifths is about reaching till the tritone, which then has to have a resolution when you overlap the fifths by 2, and you become the singing capacity of the human voice range of step motion. And therefore this allows you through scales to express yourself in a more intimate capacity than only chordal, but also therefore, there are two ways to delay the ending, is to have a deceptive cadence that has the leading tone go to the tonic, but the bass not going to the tonic. From the dominant it goes to the 6th degree. So it's a delay tactic. Then you have the modulations, which are a delay tactic. When you start in a key, and let's say I improvise a forêt style piece, I go to E minor, then I think I'm going to go to the C minor, then A major, then I can go through diminished 7th, then go back through E minor melodic, and then return to relative major. So this kind of peregrinations in French, I don't know if it's the right, in English the same cognate, I think it's taking different paths in the walk. So you go through G minor to go back to this and that, you take different ways, and every time you come back it's like, oh, such a beautiful feeling to return home, especially in sonata form. The transitions, the great masters like Mozart and early Beethoven, the bridge to the return to the recapitulation, or in the 40th Symphony. And many examples. Fauré does that so well in songs also like Clair de Lune. So he uses a lot the pivotal third that allows him to be in different tonalities, through a common pivotal tone, or two actually in cases. And so in other words, the musical discourse, the musical melodic line, regardless of the style, would it be Baroque, Romantic, or modern, or whichever, until atonal, after which the comparison between styles sort of disappears because the paradigm changes completely. I mean, when you hear something, you cannot talk about melody. But that's not the point. It's very beautifully different. But it's a completely different language and set of rules and organizational ways of thinking, hearing, imagining. It's creating a complete new universe with its own solar system. But until that atonalism, so then post that serialism, and then after that all the microtonalisms and all the other isms, the music was mostly either in Baroque moving bass or continuo, spawning the melodic line that is the aria, where the bass line is guiding, but backwards, in not backwards, back in the back seat rather, I meant to say, and the melody is the result of the harmonization, harmonic progression of a bass exercised by Vidal. So imagine you add an aria to this. Compared to the Romantic era, where you have a melodic line that is harmonized, like Chopin's first ballade, rather than in Bach Prelude, a bass line that brings you in different tonalities, and you have the long values singing on the top. But they're not harmonized. Is the melodic bass line, like in Fauré, who would do like Bach, these motions where every voice is in fact meaningful. There's no accompaniment in a melody. Well, in polyphony, all melodies are equal. You have to follow them at the same time. It's a complicated thing to do, let less to hear. But in order to hear, you have to have somebody play it. Or the initial hearing of it from the score and then reproducing it through the playing, because inevitably the piano being the sound of the piano, you don't have different sounds like on organ stops or several keyboards, or orchestra musicians with oboe, flute, and etc. So you have to do it with shadows and lights. You have to bring out, you have to voice. That's what the whole idea of the bringing out some. But then you choose which, because you cannot bring them all at the same time. If not, it becomes inevitably confusing, because the listener, well, of course, in phenomenology, people study this. Telebidache developed that so beautifully already years ago as a conductor, about the slower tempi, the time, not only, but through that, through just a simplification. not that it's good to overanalyze things, because after all, Schenkerian analysis is also a way to simplify the melodic, harmonic, rhythmic all in one, which is a synthesizing capacity of the brain. It's a marvelous. I mean, that's what is cultivated playing. The capacity to not only play the notes that you read, but to play what you understood from what the notes hint, suggest, and not all of them display fully, because the musical notation fails grandly to, when you look at it in detail, to lock in every possible innuendo, intention, subtlety between the notes. Of course, a lot is there between pitches and rhythmic values and indications of tempi and possible expressions, more or less due to the composer or the various publishers. Then, of course, the scholars and then the musicologists and blah blah. We arrive to a point where we can play erudite music like, but that doesn't mean that it's the same as playing it just by feeling and saying, after all, perhaps ignorance is bliss, because if you are over aware of the complexity of the texture, you end up by perhaps either getting confused, not knowing what to bring out. It's like in the middle of the crowd, so how do I make sense of everybody speaking at the same time? Unless I devote my attention alternatively to one or another of the speakers. So either because one speaks louder or the others go like in Bach's polyphony on the keyboard, you always have one speaking and then the other one imitating, and then the other one playing faster notes or slower notes to allow to hear the other notes of the other part across them. It's almost like a transparency. And you have a combination of 16th notes, 8th notes being 16th notes with rest, so that in between the 16th notes with air, which are 8th notes, well, staccato, you can hear the other movements. So, of course, close to the conclusion, again, the direction, the line, the cadence, the arrival point, the punctuation of the musical statement, Bach usually has both players, or in this case, two-voice invention, but 23-2, speak at the same time very fast, the stretto, where it gets busy. It gives the illusion of an accelerando after having 8th notes and 16th notes in alternation in each hand. And then, so the capacity of combining perhaps 2 against 3, or perhaps to have the melodic line either 2 against 3, fitting one out of 2 together with the bass, and the other not. So this way you hear them because they're not put together, or like Cortot in his 30s interpretation of Chopin would dislocate the bass from the melody. So in one way or the other, when the composer writes it directly, like Fauré, you have the melody singing, and then the accompaniment comes a 16th note rest after the melodic note, which you've heard alone, and then the harmonization. Had he written it with 4 16th notes harmonized, then Cortot's interpretation, or of course I purposely, for the purpose of this, oversimplify, but still, it's part of it, this dislocation he would have done in order to bring the melodic line to be heard for a nanosecond alone before the harmonization coats it and creates this atmosphere, major, minor, half, and all that. So therefore, I think the melodic line that we try to imitate, the voice on the piano, is based on the articulation, of course, which has been lost with the capacity of the contrast that the modern piano does, for which it's named forte piano, and nobody says I'm a fortist. That's a joke that is, I think, very infantile, but I enjoy it still. Why pianist? Does it mean we all play piano, right? Soft compared to forte, loud in Italian. But if the instrument's expression is all based about shouting or whispering, then the subtlety of the articulation by 2 or 3 and how much to separate, like bow change, which is more of a reinitialization of the energy rather than separation, compared to the equal air legato with space or no, or over legato. But then you can, under the legato, have different groupments of articulations in terms of if you want to have 2 and 3, or 1 and 2, or 2 and 2. More or less pronounced, because the piano speaks with articulation through the hammer hitting the string. You hear the moment of impact, pa, 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 like a consonant. And if you want to diminish that, you play within the side the key before the key holds fully up. So you hear ta ha 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 ha, and not ta 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 ta, unless the articulation demands it for the character or the expression of the piece. So staccato, non legato, tenuto are choices of length of sound of the pearls, if you wanted to have this analogy. I like to have that analogy too, of the pearl necklace, where each pearl is even, and you have this kind of jeu perlé was called Paris conservatories, World War II days and before. Nicknamed the piano touch of French technique, was supposed to be jeu perlé, pearled playing. But the idea that some of the pearls can be uneven, some are bigger than others. Then you have the voicing. But beyond the voicing, the articulation of the groupments. Of course, by the time you put the pedal, and you're in some acoustic room with a beautiful piano in a concert hall, you might hear just a soup of notes. So the pedal can cancel all your articulation expressions of subtle innuendos. Or then, if you played very shortly or very after each harmonic progression changes the note. This way you don't have the residue of the precedent. If not, you get you don't want to hear. Therefore, you play the pedal once you've played the bass note, then you take it off on the downbeat of the new harmony, then you put it down again in order to resonate and keep the bass note from the accompaniment, since Chopin always writes two-handed left hand, one for the bass in the waltz in question with the harmonization, and the right hand for the melody. So the left hand dance, the right hand sing, canta baila, Spanish for singing and dancing. But if you drone it in pedal, then the harmonic progression prevails. And it sounds like a chorale, which is what it is, like SATB. Like Bach chorales at the end of the cantatas. Every syllable is sung at the same time in harmonizations in several voices. But you also have the capacity of direction of line of flow with the delays through the cacciaturas, appoggiaturas, suspensions, of course ornamentations, not to confuse the decorations. The trills, the ornaments compared to decorations could have been, of course, by that time you can say, oh, well, if Naoumoff thinks he can rewrite every piece, then he doesn't play the piece. And Mademoiselle Boulanger used to tell me, analysis, of course, brings you to a certain critical point of view. Not that you criticize the piece, but to understand it, you try to see what is from what, how to read intelligently the score, how to extract therefore the meaning from the elements, in just like you do in literature, in mathematics, in any human thinking process. You evaluate, you separate, you organize, you contrast, you compare, and then you display. And I find that to be a cultivated pianist doesn't mean to be only erudite in knowledge and become a composer, or even learn how to compose, even if you don't want to compose, in order to play even more meaningfully in ultimate destiny what exactly the composer wrote, but with the conviction that is the only way possible, that you understand it as a performer, not just reciting it because it's written and scholars approved it, but it becomes, through all this process, it might take time until you absorb the harmonic progression, the melodic meaning, the symbolism, the texture, the context, and of course you go to the stylistic understanding, regardless on which instrument you play. All these layers at some point blend or melt into a simplicity, or apparently so, I would say, the self-evidence of the sculpted articulation of the piano playing, like a sculptor shaping the original material and brings it to perhaps a representation either of a face or a body, or perhaps of an abstract shape that can be evocative, perhaps even more spiritually, of other elements. Everything can and is in aspects or different ways accepted as spiritual, uplifting music in the first place, especially the music beyond the usage of it, like which was most of the centuries necessity, music to pray, music to enjoy in terms of different seasons of life, between marriage and funerals, and music that is to enjoy or to console or to excite, as well as to uplift. Perhaps an army through a march, or waltz dancers through the dance music that gives the constant rebirth of the pulse on each beat and gives you this sense of flow. And if you take off the pedal, you can hear it, but more by each articulation. Going fast, you can hear everything connected. What if you subphrase? If you want to bring out the first beats and then the others as decorative patterns, which could have been, because they are not, then you appreciate the way it is. Of course, the details combined don't make the whole, because it becomes confusing. Rather, they blend in the situation where the essence of the combination of all of the elements that the composer left us in the written music, silently read, notated score, what we bring back to life every time we do it, we play it with our convictions or our misunderstandings, possibly. And after all, it's part of the idea. It's not like archaeology. Well, actually, also in part, you discover unknowns out of little elements that you could salvage, and you try to imagine how it was. The animal structure of the body, or I don't know, architectural structures that you unearth. Same thing happens with playing piano. Is almost like imaginary, I at least believe in that, building imaginary architectures, of course through the form, but beyond that, every shape has to have its like the leap of the ascending sixth. It's expressive compared to the semitone that follows, closing down when the leap was up. And in order to express it even more so, because it's minor compared to if it was major, or if it was not up but because it is not down, but it is up. Then you have to prepare the down note, the bottom note, to prepare the ascension to the upper note, which in fact acts as an appoggiatura to the fifth. So it's already decorative. We could have been, if further pushed more expressively up, which he didn't do. So now that we know what he didn't do, what he could have done, or we don't know why he didn't do it, because it's his choice after all, and we're here centuries after, not to try to make sense and think, oh, why did he not do this or that, but through the options that we intelligently read in the music, then we hierarchize the importance of the elements, and then when we present them to the audience, we don't display all this kitchen work with all the ingredients and all the machines that you need to chop, prepare, and organize. You just serve a sauce, and then people taste it and go, oh, it's divine, or too much this or not enough that, or some people don't even know which ingredients they taste. But it's all about the balance and the balance of the different ingredients. And so you don't show the kitchen when you go to the restaurant. You only bring the results from the kitchen work. And I think that a performer has in part a pedagogical aspect to his or her call of duty, is by the choices they do of tempi, articulation, or they can change within an acceptable margin the character of the piece to a certain extent, by especially the articulation. And that is the A minor Bach Prelude in Fugue, well-timed clarinet. If you do, then you could say, oh, but that's too much characteristic, because as soon as you do staccato, it becomes either comical, either anxiety. By 2 or by 4, then it becomes more harmonic or melodic. Or the chromatic scale in the left hand, separated or by 2. In other words, it's not about the way I present it, obviously now, in short and in simplification, it ends up by appearing something like garden, where you choose which kind of plants, aromatic or vegetables, you're going to grow, or just flowers for the aesthetic beauty and smell of it, and perhaps a combination of them. And so in a way, you're the gardener, the sculptor in this sense, also the architect of the piece you play, which exists, of course, in the notation, but once it's brought to life, you bring in more vowels, more phrasing, more direction, and all of a sudden a piece can appear to some people, oh, it's too fast, or it's too slow, compared to what? What is the criteria? What is the meaning? Where does it lead? What do I want to do when I play this piece? What do I want to bring to the listener in order for the listener's own introspection, questioning, to become something which leaves us, after having attended a theater play or reading a book that questions our humanity, ourselves, our beliefs, our everything. Of course, it's very good to have also, and we do, plenty of entertaining music to make us forget our finitude, to make us forget our worries, to make us forget our sorrows. Fine, that's true. It's also good to have. And of course, the action of playing the piano becomes then some kind of an ending by itself. After all, the craftsmanship, if I play all the notes in the right place, it's going to sound good because I am not the composer. If the composer wrote it, as I write, if I play exact according to what I think the best edition says, then I don't have the responsibility to recompose, architecturally rebuild, or perhaps restate. But that's not true. Like an actor, you can portray character of a book in a, let's say, film or a theater play very differently, because your interpretation through your body expression, like opera singers, ballet dancers, whose instruments are their bodies, literally, compared to the piano, which is through an instrument, and even more indirect than most other instruments, since we don't touch the string, in this case directly, the sound production, the vibrato, like string players, wind players do, of course singers do. But at the same time, we are able to play on the piano everything for piano written, as well as everything not written for piano. Even harpsichord music, of course, as we do daily when we play Bach and before. Couperin, d'Anglebert, Caspar Fischer, and so many, if we do. But you cannot play on the harpsichord, for instance, a Rachmaninoff piece. It's really written for the piano by Rachmaninoff, like Scriabin, Liszt, Chopin, Mettner, and so many of these pianist virtuoso like Busoni composers, compared to Beethoven, more conceptual. Well, he also played piano forte of his time, but not with the virtuosity that reached later with these whom we know since, and which makes it very difficult actually for today's piano playing, how to transcend the fact that we or isolate ourselves from having heard postmodern dissonances when we play music of a past music time, where the audacity of these induced dissonances and resolutions by thirds, they could appear, which they're not, but they could appear lame if you have a lot of modern music in mind, where the dissonances are it. They're not in order to be tension releases with consonances. There is no more concept of dissonance and consonance in post-tonal music. But in the, let's say, span of 4 or 5 centuries of tonal rule music with different styles that change it completely while remaining in the core with the same dominant tonic, leading tone, and resolution. I mean, it's fascinating to see that, in fact, most of the tonal music composers through the centuries followed each other at different stages of time period, since most of them died also very young. Is a suite of theme and variation on the theme of the perfect cadence, or what to do before to end, where to modulate, where to travel, secondary dominance modulations, secondary voices, say a third or equal voices, suspensions, delays, accaciaturas from above, under, or appoggiaturas from above. And it brings not just a bubble talk, and the piano very often makes us play everything even, but with the expression. So how much of the detail has to be all expressed depends on the instrument and your understanding of the style that you translate on the instrument, in the interpretation, in the literal sense of the word translation, interpreter. I tried purposely in a little bit in my typical excitement mode, when the thoughts collide in my brain, in order to display the various, and there's still many more, ingredients which embellish, express, mean, or give a deep sense of purpose to music, what we call classical music, for a lack of a better term, but covers so much more than classical era, for sure. Of course, that in a way, all this is like all life into one note. And then at the following note. And then the following note. Oops, an accent I didn't control. I started too soft. Then I say 3 steps sounds. Then I have a leap. Then a second voice. Exchange of voices. Where does it lead me to? I intrigue my listener through the piece or my improvisation in this case. Then a third voice. Do I forget the first 2? But I still follow the third voice. Of course, if it's a lower voice, then I hear it more than the top voices for the length of decay. And I add more voices. And the more it gets busy in terms of texture, embark the listener with me through the piece, like I take them through my playing by the hand, so to say, and say, come with me to visit this incredible place. This place which is so incredible. It's a different world. The difference between Forêt Nocturne or a Bach variation or a Beethoven variation. So they're so different, while in common they have this tonal language that is more in the structure, that allows to have different coatings, different ways of being. And I believe at the nucleus level, it is important to do the articulation, the phrasing, the direction of the line. If it brings me from this to this, then I know where I go. And I know if I want to take the time to express it, either by sforzando, if it's written, or by an articulation on that note, as if it's a restatement of the consonant after the vowels, or just legato. In a way, the articulation on music is exactly what it is in speaking, is the enunciation. Of course, you don't speak usually when you speak. One doesn't do spelling bee contest when one speaks, in which case it'll be like every note. No, it's the groupment of notes with the direction, even if they're legato or staccato or air legato. Or bubble talk in music, and me constantly. Bubble talk Emile. But I really enjoyed sharing with you this effervescence of expression devices that we have to filter through our understanding and love for the piece we translate to the audience.